Okay, we're good.
Happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome back to the Ancestral Healing Center Cafe Chats. We are well into we're over 6 months. Are we over 6 months of doing the Ancestral Healing Center Cafe Chats? Yeah. So it's been really fantastic. I hope you guys have enjoyed it as much as we have. Today,
Mhm.
we have an exciting and a little bit more condensed topic for you today. We are talking about ancestral revision. We have to look for it to heal it. And today we are doing this session based off of a lot of feedback that we've received. Some people have asked, well, what does ancestral healing have to do with me in this lifetime right now? And I think it's pretty resounding between the three of us. We would say everything, right? So our philosophy here at the Ancestral Healing Center is that we are only ourselves in context, and that we are made up of the stories and the experiences of those who have come before us. And that by looking at those stories, we can really transform our own lives and our own identity. So for today, we are going to be going through a four-part kind of workshopping around what does ancestral healing have to do with us, and how can it improve our lives and make us better people, better parents, better business people, just overall better individuals. So another little treat for you that we're going to throw in here today is, for any of you Neville Goddard fans out there, we are going to be incorporating some of Neville's work, and I'm going to be walking you through that based on my own experience with ancestral healing and using Neville's philosophy as well. So first, we're going to get started with Bernadette, and Bernadette is our digger. Bernadette is our excavator. She's our resident genealogist. And Bernadette, I'm going to let you kick off step one, locating the story.
Thank you, Ruschelle. I'll take those compliments because it truly is what has brought me to this work, is just that deep sense of trying to find the story. So one of the, what we were just talking about is um, finding the story and then rewriting our ancestral story so that we're not carrying what happened. And trauma informed genealogy comes down to just that. So the pain isn't yours to carry. So what we try and do is we go a little deeper, and if we don't look for it, then we continue to carry it. So that is the whole reason why going back and looking at your ancestry is part of your healing, because it's kind of like, if we don't know the story, then we make it up. And so in many cases, we make it up thinking that this story is mine. And so that's why it is so important about looking back, looking at your ancestors. And as we see what they have gone through, I've used the example of my dad and his mom and her sisters, and the really challenging, difficult time that they went through, as all the girls were put in an orphanage after their father passed away. Then my father's mother and father both passed away when he was very young. This is really heavy stuff. And I found myself carrying some of this with me, not realizing that if I looked more at the story, that I would understand where these feelings were coming from. And that's exactly what happened. So as the story opened, and first the story was my dad's parents had passed away from tuberculosis, which was kind of common back then. There was this pain he was carrying, and I began to recognize that his pain wasn't my pain. And then when I looked deeper, I saw that, as I said, my great aunts had all been in an orphanage. Again, it was their pain, wasn't my pain, but it helped me to truly know that what I was carrying, there was a story there. And as I began to learn more about the story changed, because the story wasn't about their pain. The story was about how they came through it and how I could learn from them coming through it. And I didn't have to hold on to that pain. And what happens after that is that we, once we know the story and once we realize that it's even there, that there's something to look at, as we begin to honor that story. And all of us, there isn't anyone on the planet that doesn't have this kind of story in the past. And it's all about whether we know about it and whether we are recognizing that the feelings that we have or the anxiety or those things come from this story that we haven't been told. So when we learn the story and we begin to honor it, that's when things really begin to change, because there is this, I don't have to carry it. The pain my dad felt growing up with knowing that he had lost both his parents, particularly his mom. Every time I saw that pain in him, I felt it. And once I began to honor that that was something that wasn't, they weren't able to control, this was something that happened, and realizing that I didn't have to carry it, I just started to honor it and honor him for what he had gone through. So it's naming what happened, and not softening it or skipping over it, but not feeling like this is mine. And that's the part of the story that, all of what we'll be talking about today, this is the important part to start with, that when we go looking, we're looking for something that isn't mine. And so that's where I would start today.
Bernadette, can you tell the listeners two concrete things? So, if someone said, "How do I learn my story?" what would be your first answer to that?
Well, it's more than one thing, but there are two things. One, what have you been told? What do you know? What little bits have been told? And then it is to go back. You can do it in a couple of ways. It could go back to build the family tree, but we've been talking about the emotional family tree kit, where you look at the emotions that you're feeling, and then you begin to look back and say, where did these emotions, where are they coming from? Is it coming from one side of the family or the other? So I would say it starts with what you are feeling and how you approach looking at that.
Okay, so um, write down what you've been told about your family and also use the emotional family tree kit as a guide to start connecting the facts to the story to the emotions.
Correct.
Yeah. And then the next question, Bernadette, is how do we honor? When you say I want to honor my family, what are some tools to do that?
Oh my goodness, that is it's a beautiful question. You honor by uh, allowing yourself to forgive, because sometimes we're holding on to uh, this anger or emotions, and we allow ourselves to look at the story and say, I can look at this and I can forgive the fact that I have been carrying this with me. And that's one way. The other way is to recognize that it is it is a story, and that they didn't necessarily have control over what happened to them. And because of that, there weren't, we might be thinking, wanting to put blame, but weren't, they didn't have the tools to change what happened to them. And so and just like without looking for our story, we lack the tools for our own healing.
Okay, thank you, Bernadette. So specific forgiveness practices are definitely a way of honoring. Michael, do you have any other tips and tricks for honoring our ancestors? Oh, you're muted, Michael. Michael, you're muted. Here, let's see if we can unmute you. Hold on. Bernadette, can you? Michael, can you hear?
Mm, can't hear.
Michael, you're muted. You're muted. That's okay. Say it
Yes.
again.
So there are 2 points I want to make. The first is around, how does ancestral healing relate to me? And the answer to that is, if you're feeling emotions that don't appear to have a story, that you can't locate a source for them, then you're potentially dealing with an ancestral source. So it could be a pain that you can't identify, just a dull feeling inside. It could be anxiety. It could be a sense of grief that's disproportionate to some kind of event. So all of these are entry points into the story, and entry points for locating the story. So as well as working with concrete evidence, as Bernadette spoke of, we can also work in through the feelings. And the other thing I would say is the story is looking for you.
Mm.
And as soon as you start, and it's as soon as you start going towards it, it starts coming towards you. It's almost like once you open your radar up, you start noticing things that you weren't noticing before. It could be, when I hear this old song from the 1970s, why does that affect me? It could be a piece of artwork. It could be almost absolutely anything. It could be you go to cook a recipe and you feel something and you go, what's this to do with? And it's the story trying to find a way out through you now. And so all of these are ways into locating the story and getting into a place where you are able to do the revision.
And Michael, do you have specific thoughts about honoring the story? Once we know the story, what are some of your favorite things to do to kind of...
I've just been through an example of this, so I'd like to leave that to my section at the end, if that's okay.
Okay, sure. Okay, so we'll come back to the viewers will have to wait for that. Bernadette, any last thoughts about excavating, digging, understanding the story?
I think what Michael said is the story is looking for you, and and feelings are often the way that you understand. So I think that's probably one of the most important things, because when when the story um, when you start have that feeling to start looking, it's waiting, it's there, and you will find it.
Yes, anybody who's interested in this, if they get the tug, it will keep tugging. So that leads us into one tool or technique that we can use once we've got the stories and we have a sense of, oh, okay, maybe this is where my parents or my grandparents issues have impacted my life, or I can see this pattern. Then that's where Neville Goddard comes in, and that's where I kind of feel like there's a good overlap. There's some places where Neville Goddard can't fully help us, and that's where we feel like ancestral healing is a good pair with Neville. So Neville Goddard is the king of revision. So he really teaches us to use our own human imagination to revise our inner world, and that's going to be reflected in our day-to-day life. And that goes along with classic cognitive behavioral therapy. So if we have our thoughts and our feelings, they impact our behaviors. It's exactly the same thing. So, one of the cool things about Neville, one of his philosophies is everyone is you pushed out. And what does he mean by that? He means that everything and everyone in your environment is a reflection of you. And so, where Neville doesn't go is Neville doesn't really account for our ancestors as being real people who went through real problems. He doesn't go into that territory of work, and I think that's where the work of that Bernadette you do, you stay in the facts and the stories and honoring those stories and helping people process the very real grief that goes on when we have tragedies in our family history. Neville wants us to play in our imagination. So once we've kind of gotten the stories, Neville says, you've got this story about your grandmother that you're carrying, and it is part imagination, because although you may know the facts, you can't fully know your grandparents' experience, and you might be projecting some of your own stuff onto your ancestors. There's a whole Your story gets kind of jumbled. So, because it's jumbled, Neville says that we have the liberty to make it what we want. And so, one of the things that I have loved doing is playing around with revision for my ancestors. And how do I do that? What I've done is I have taken stories of my ancestors, and I have written them and rewritten them and changed the perspective of them and looked at them from multiple different angles so that I wasn't stuck in a single angle. So, an example of that would be one that I talk about in my first book that I interviewed Michael for. So, Michael is the first interview in Inherited Trauma and Family Wealth. That's how we met. Get the book, read Michael's story, and then you can follow up with him later. But anyway, I went on a tangent and I forgot the story that I was going with after that. Revising. Yes, my grandfather worked in the coal mines. And when I was a little girl, I was told that my grandfather was paid in scrip. So scrip is the coal company money. Coal miners were not paid in dollars in the United States. They were paid in scrip that was only to be spent in the company store, meaning that you could not acquire wealth very easily. And there's all of these songs about just being constantly indebted to the company store at the end of the month, as like this is what people were kind of trapped in terms of like an indentured servitude. So when I learned that my grandfather worked, I was very young when I learned the story, and I was also learning about indentured servants from the Middle Ages at the time. And I remember thinking, wow, my granddad didn't have really much of an opportunity to earn wealth. It was as if he was a paid slave, right? An indentured servant. And that was the story that carried with me from the time I was an adolescent. And I felt really sorry. I had like a lot of pity for my grandfather that he couldn't, in my mind, it's like he can't access free markets. He was like trapped. And I really got caught and hung up on that story. So as an adult, I had an opportunity to rewrite that narrative. Why do I need to see my grandfather as someone trapped in a financial system that he'll never get out of? Because there are other dimensions to my granddad that I could focus on. He was an autodidactic human. He taught himself English. He was an avid farmer. He could cook any amazing food that you wanted. He had an abundance of friends in the community. He had a family that loved him. So, this is the story that I would like to lead with, is that my grandfather was this multifaceted individual who was able to leave his family an inheritance that my father then turned into a larger inheritance. That's a way happier story than my grandfather was an indentured servant after he came to the United States. So that's an example of Neville Goddard's revision, because that's the story that is carried in my wonderful human imagination. And we don't get to pick our ancestors, but we do get to pick the stories that our human imagination carries about those individuals and their experiences. So that ends kind of the Neville Goddard section of today. Michael or Bernadette, do you have thoughts about using Neville Goddard's revision technique when we talk about our ancestors?
I'm going to speak on that as we move into the next section as well. So I'm saving it all up.
Okay, Bernadette, so any thoughts for you?
Yeah, my thoughts are it is a beautiful way of understanding. We know what it's like to go through difficult times in our lives, and I like the fact that you are recognizing him as this beautiful grandfather who has done so much and had all these different sides to him. And the story's still there, and it's okay, but it just feels, I was lightning as you were telling the story. So that's what it feels like when you change the narrative.
Yeah, when we tell people, like if somebody asks me who was your grandfather, well, he was a multifaceted autodidactic who learned everything himself and was just, this incredible human, right? Rather than the other one. So okay. Well, on that, we have this other we've dug up the story, we've honored the story, we've looked at it and made it our own, and then we've kind of revised that story. And so I'm going to let Michael share what is the next step after we've done that, Michael.
Thank you. So I actually did this exercise yesterday around my great-grandfather. And this is because this story of my great-grandfather and his generation and his children has come up very big for me over the last couple of months. And I've been speaking on that in some of the other cafe chats. And what happened was that my grandfather and his eldest surviving son died within a day of each other in 1925, and it literally blew the family to pieces. And eventually I recognized that his son, my great uncle, his grave was almost like the place where this secret, because this was never known, was being held. And last week I went down and visited that grave, which was a very powerful experience. And last night I did this revision exercise, and I did the revision around my great grandfather, who'd had this very troubled life. His marriage failed, and he'd had another son that had died young. And then he got caught up in some tax fraud. And eventually, when he was 51, he went on trial and he was convicted, and he was sent to prison for 6 months, where his health broke. And then a couple of years after that, then he passed away along with his younger son. So it was not a great life. So I went back to him, to connecting to his story. And I went back to the moment where he knowingly or unknowingly got involved in the tax fraud. And this was involving a chain of pubs that he was one of the managers at. And I don't know whether he knew what was going on, or whether he just got caught up in it, and ignorance is no defense in the law. What we do know, the facts that we know are that the sum of the embezzlement was £46,000 in 1922, which is equivalent to £2.3 million, so $2.5 million today. So this was a sizable operation. And there were 7 men who were put on trial. 2 of them were acquitted, and 2 of them, including my grandfather, received the shortest sentence, which was a 6-month sentence. And again, so this suggests he was an accomplice rather than a ringleader. As I say, it's not appropriate for me to project anything more onto that situation and say, he can't have known about it or whatever, because I honestly don't know. But I went back to that moment when he either knowingly bought into it, or he just became unknowingly involved. And it was really moving. And what I encountered was his regret. His regret that this had caused so much disruption for the family, and then it disrupted his health. It must have affected all of his children. And just that sense of regret. And I've had this with another ancestor, actually with my grandmother, his daughter. When I worked through her story, what came out was this regret that this path had been followed. But what came out, and this is similar to the way in that Ruschelle has changed the perspective on her great-grandfather, is that through doing this exercise, what I saw that I hadn't seen before was that he was a solo father with 5 young children.
Mm.
And that's going to affect the financial choices that you make. And that allows me to approach his story from a place of neutrality and compassion, and just recognizing that for whatever reason he wasn't able to make a better choice at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So Neville Goddard, and he talks about using assumption to change our future by assuming the state that we want to be in and assuming that we've got it now. But actually assumption works both ways. So assumption works backwards, because these stories that we're dealing with from the past that happened before we were born, they come to us as assumptions. So this situation in 1925 blew my family apart for a couple of generations, and by the time it comes down to me, I'm assuming that I'm not good enough. I'm assuming poverty. I'm assuming shame. So I'm assuming all of these things, and by going back into them, we're reaching into them. And as we do, we find we find what these different feelings are. And very often, in my experience, shame is the doorway into the feelings, because shame is the one that we don't want to feel and the one that makes us push the story away. So shame is like the entry feeling. And once you come in through the doorway into the full range of feelings around this experience, and this is where looking at these different perspectives that Ruschelle spoke of is really useful. I encountered heartbreak and loss, and then grief. And saying grief is very often just as shame is the entry point into a knot of feelings. Grief is the exit point. Grief is the one that we process and then we close. And as say, I went down to this cemetery in South London last week, where I'd managed to locate the grave of my great uncle. The son who died on literally the day after my great grandfather had died, and I went there and I laid some white roses on this grave that has probably never been visited since 1925.
Mm.
And this is about letting go. So letting go is not something you can force. You can't. It's something you have to allow. And with the roses, I'm saying this has been laid clean. This has been made clean again, and this is no longer a story. So it's been rinsed and laundered and brought to a neutral state. Mm-hmm. And in here, one of the things Neville Goddard talks about, he calls the law of reversibility, and he says that every force is reversible. And this is the basis of his assumption work: is that if you assume your future state, that you can create it. But it also works the other way. So I can take a physical action, like laying down these roses on this grave, and I'm actually using that to push back into my feelings. So I'm using the force in the other way, because I'm doing it consciously, and I'm doing it with compassion and respect and neutrality. And in so doing, we can bring this revision in and say, I have this completely revised view of the situation as a result of going through this experience.
Yeah, I think that's powerful, Michael. And, as somebody who has, I had the loss of my husband to alcoholism 8 years ago, and trying to fight the story of this alcoholic that blew his family apart, which did happen, but also he had an incredibly beautiful soul, and I knew that this wasn't his choice. So it is, but when we don't have that information when we look back, we have to go a little bit deeper in order to find that story, that here was a man that didn't want to be an alcoholic. He wanted everything to have been, and it's changing the way, as we heal and go through this process, it's changing it for the next generation. And so that they understand there's more to the story than just what we think or we feel. So that was powerful, because that was very powerful.
Yeah, beautiful story, Michael. I just want to respond to a couple of things that you said. Neville's technique of assumptions. So any technique that we talk about here can also, and probably at some point has also been used as a, I'm going to call it a weapon against us. So they're tools, right? Assumptions are tools. And just like in cognitive behavioral therapy, all of cognitive behavioral therapy calls a lot of the ways our mind copes with things, they call those cognitive distortions. Well, that's pretty negative. They're not cognitive distortions if they're used in the right place. So they're only a cognitive distortion if they're misappropriated. And just like Neville's assumptions, I think in inherited trauma, we just get these things thrown on us, and our unconscious assumes them for us as a coping, as a distortion, right? So what we want to do is make our thoughts conscious and take control of the assumptions, take control of the imagination. There was one other thing that you said, um, that I always used to say, use your imagination for good. In my therapy sessions, I would say, why are you, if you're going to use your imagination, why are you using it to hurt yourself or be critical of yourself? Like, let's use it for good. And then the other thing you talked about, Michael, was shame as an entry point and all of these emotions. And I think that ties back to what Bernadette says. When we start getting the story, we're going to feel things intensely that we're taken off guard by. Why am I crying so much about this? Why did I have a sense of guilt about this? And that's your indicator that you've landed on inherited trauma. So that's, that's the gold that we're trying to, that is probably not your feeling. That's probably an inherited feeling. And then there was one last thing. Oh, now we haven't ventured into retrocausality here, but some people believe, and again, we don't have to, you take what we share here and use what you like, and then, drop what you don't like. But some people actually believe that if we intend that what we're doing now impacts the past, it doesn't just impact the future, it absolutely impacts the past. And you can believe as much as you want about that. If I imagined my grandmother living a life that was maybe a little bit more pleasant, could that actually change her life if time is fluid? I don't know. We're going to leave that. Let us know in the comments what you think about retrocausality. But that is something that we could talk about at another time. But Neville would say, well, he had you revise your own day. So he was revising the past constantly.
Mm-hmm.
When you lay down on your pillow at night, revise the day the way you wanted it to be. That's a version of revising the past. And so if we extend that out beyond ourselves, could I reimagine my birth? Maybe I was born in Switzerland. Maybe I want to focus on that instead. Maybe I want to imagine that. How would that change my future? And so I'm just throwing that out there. If you have comments about retrocausality, please let us know. Any other last thoughts about all of these? We've gone full circle today with digging the story, honoring the story, revisioning some parts of the story, and processing the emotions and the shame with it. Anything else before we wrap up today?
No, it feels quite well wrapped up.
Yeah, okay. Well, let us know if you like these Neville Goddard tie-ins to the ancestral work. We are going to have a workbook up on the website soon that corresponds with this episode. And of course, the Emotional Family Tree Kit is in the link attached to this live as well. So until next time, have a great week.